If anyone tries to tell you that baseball is America's favorite pastime, they're trying to sell you a fat load of honky-tonk hogwash, because America's favorite pastime is gridiron football. Indeed, NFL football is America's most popular sport, and every year, two teams emerge from the NFL's two conferences to compete in the Super Bowl and determine once and for all the world champion. This year is Super Bowl 59, which will be played on February 9th, and there are a lot of great football teams that could win the Super Bowl this year, but one team that can't win it is the Kansas City Chiefs. Now, the Chiefs are a big deal. See, winning a Super Bowl is very hard. Even the most dominant football teams will often fail to win a Super Bowl. Just to get to the Super Bowl, you have to survive a single elimination playoff bracket. However, the previous two seasons, the Kansas City Chiefs have been Super Bowl champions. Now, if winning a single Super Bowl is hard, you can imagine that winning back-to-back Super Bowls is much, much more difficult. The last time this feat was accomplished was the 2003 and 2004 Patriots. This news headline says triple crowns because by winning back-to-back championships, the Patriots had actually managed to win 3 Super Bowls in 4 years. The Chiefs did a similar thing. When they won their second straight Super Bowl, that was actually their third in 5 years. If the Chiefs were to win Super Bowl 59, they would be the first team in NFL history to win 3 Super Bowls in a row. The three-peat has never been done. That, of course, means that in 2005, the Patriots failed to win a third straight Super Bowl. So what happened to them in 2005? Well, in 2005, they had a weaker season, winning only 10 games and losing 6. They did make the playoffs, and in the first round of the playoffs, called the wild card round, they beat the Jaguars. In fact, they completely whooped the Jaguars 28-3, and if you go up 28-3 on a team, well, it's a lock. You're not going to lose that game. So that was easy. Then they moved on to the divisional round. That's the second round of the playoffs, where they were knocked out by the Broncos. So the Patriots were sent packing with a measly 2 straight Super Bowls. The Broncos would go on to be eliminated by the Steelers in the AFC Championship game. So fast forward about 20 years to the 2024 Chiefs season, and another team is knocking on the door of winning a third straight Super Bowl. Unlike the Patriots, who had a fairly weak 2005 season, winning only 10 games, the Chiefs won 15 games. They went 15-2 this season. For those who don't follow the NFL, yes, the season length was increased. Back in 2005, it was 16 games. For a good handful of years now, seasons have been 17 games long. Unlike the Patriots in 2005, the Chiefs won enough games this year to not have to play in the wild card round of the playoffs. Their first playoff game will be this weekend against the Texans. If they win, they'll move on to the AFC Championship game, where one more win will get them into Super Bowl 59, where they have a chance to win a third straight. Now, aside from Chiefs fans, pretty much nobody wants this to happen. Well, I have good news. The 2024 Chiefs will not three-peat. How do I know? Well, consider a triangle with one right angle. This is called a right-angled triangle, and it's one of the most classic theorems of mathematics that the sum of the squares of the legs of such a triangle is equal to the square of the longest side, which is called the hypotenuse. This is the famous Pythagorean theorem. A squared plus b squared equals c squared. Actually, wait. Sorry, I just love this theorem, but this isn't the Pythagorean theorem we're going to need. We're going to need a slightly different Pythagorean result. But to understand what Pythagoras has to do with any of this, we need to rewind. We could rewind as far back as the 1800s, but I'm going to take our story just back to the 2002 Oakland Athletics amateur draft. This is a baseball team, by the way, so we are switching sports. I know, it's getting complicated. But in the Oakland Athletics draft room, we've got a bunch of former baseball players who now work on the scouting team, and they're having a big discussion trying to sift out the players they're most interested in drafting. Also in the room is the Oakland A's general manager, Billy Beane, who would have been the star of many discussions just like this one back when he was in high school. He's also got his assistant, Harvard graduate Paul de Podesta, who's got his computer with him and is looking at all sorts of numbers. You may wonder why I've arranged these two groups so that they appear opposed, even though they're working on the draft for the same team. Well, they definitely were opposed once Billy Beane brought up Jeremy Brown. As bringing up Jeremy Brown as a top player they should consider, the scouting team has been thrown an absolute curveball. They all have around 1,000 players ranked above Jeremy Brown on their scouting lists, so this seems absolutely farcical. Jeremy Brown is 240 pounds. And indeed, the scouting team is very quick to dismiss this. They say he has a soft, fleshy kind of body. When he walks, his thighs stick together. Paul de Podesta contends that Jeremy leads the country in walks, which is a sign he has great control over his striking. The scouts simply say, well, he better walk because he can't run. He's got big thighs and he's huge in the ass. You can, of course, see what they're talking about in this photo, where Jeremy Brown is about to hit a home run, knocking the ball 60 feet over the fences for what baseball folk, I think, call a humdinger. So why were Billy Beane and Paul de Podesta so compelled by this huge-assed baseball player that none of the scouts had any interest in? Well, the scouting team was playing this game the way baseball guys always had. They were looking for high school ball players that had the right body, the right face, and on whom they could project a future of baseball stardom. But Billy Beane and Paul de Podesta had started playing an entirely different game. They were playing Moneyball. You see, running a team, just like using this luxurious metallic Sharpie, takes a lot of cash. And certainly, if a team wants to sign the best players, they're going to have to spend the most money. And so it would be no surprise that richer teams have a huge advantage over poorer teams. And this seems like a simple and obvious enough inequality. If you want the good stuff, you've got to pay the good stuff. And the Oakland A's were one of the poorest teams in the league, so it'd be no surprise that they were absolutely stinking it up. Now, how big are the disparities we're talking about? Well, in 2002, the richest team was the New York Yankees. Their payroll was around $126 million. And you can get some killer ball players for that kind of money. On the other hand, the two poorest teams were the Tampa Bay Devil Rays, who have since renamed to simply the Rays, and the Oakland Athletics. Both of these teams had a payroll of a measly $40 million. With financial disparities this significant in baseball, how badly were the Athletics floundering? Well, of course, that's the twist, because at this point, the Oakland Athletics had won more regular season games than almost every other team in the league in the previous few years. From 1999 to 2002, the poor Oakland Athletics had won 383 regular season games. Again, they trailed only the Atlanta Braves, who won 387 games in that same time span. So how was this possible? Despite being at the bottom of the league in terms of how much money the Athletics were paying, they were at the top of the league in terms of their performance. It's a shocking thing. Well, the Athletics were taking an approach to their scouting which seems, in retrospect, obvious, but at the time was a bit novel, and that's called performance scouting. Instead of scouting players based on potential and often taking what looked like promising high school prospects, they were more interested in taking proven college players who had great track records, great statistics, and who were already solid in important respects of the game. In scouting Jeremy Brown, they had seen that he had tons and tons of walks over the last couple of years, which to the Oakland Athletics philosophy was a very good thing. If you don't know what a walk is, in baseball, the batter swings the bat to hit a ball which is pitched by the pitcher. Generally speaking, the ball is supposed to be pitched into the strike zone, where the batter has a fair shake at actually hitting the ball. However, to keep the batter on his toes, the pitcher has the option of throwing a ball that's actually outside of the strike zone and would not be good to hit. If a pitcher throws such a ball, and the batter doesn't swing, it's called a ball, and if 4 balls are earned, the batter can take a walk, which is basically a free trip to the first base. Now, of course, to do this performance scouting requires tracking statistics, like how many walks a batter earns, but there are a lot more sophisticated statistics that could be really useful too, and this all really starts with a fella named Bill James. Bill James was absolutely obsessed with baseball stats, and found that no official channels connected to the league were doing a very good job publishing them. So he started collecting and comparing and studying statistics himself, and from 1977 up through 1984, he published a yearly edition of what he called the Baseball Abstract. In these baseball abstracts, not only did he have basic things like hits and runs and walks, but he also had statistics which he came up with himself that he thought would be useful. He's credited with creating many statistics such as RC, which stands for runs created, and can be used to measure an individual player's contribution to a team's offense, as well as being used to predict how many runs a team could score. He's also credited with inventing DER, the Defensive Efficiency Rating. In the end, Bill James' fanatic obsession with baseball statistics and using them to find new insights into the sport caught on with fans and eventually some general managers as well. It's through leaving the old baseball scouting wisdom behind and embracing this new world of statistics that Paul DePodesta and Billy Beane were able to find undervalued players and sign them for a price they could afford. While a high school ball player may look incredibly promising and thus fetch a huge price from teams willing and able to pay it, the Oakland Athletics were more interested in signing college players who maybe didn't look so flashy and maybe didn't look like they had boundless potential, but through looking at the stats, you could see exactly what they did have and what they could bring to your team for a low price. This art of finding and signing undervalued players, which allowed a poor team like the Oakland Athletics to be incredibly successful, became known as Moneyball, and you can read all about it in the book of the same name. A lot of the statistics that Bill James came up with could be applied to an individual player or an individual team, or even an entire league, but there is perhaps one team statistic which is more important than all others, and that's wins and losses, W's and L's. A team's legacy is really defined by winning games, so wouldn't it be great if we were able to predict how many wins and losses a team might have? There's a very simple way we might do this, which is to just take a team's win-loss record in one year as a reasonable prediction for their win-loss record in the next year. For example, suppose we're approaching the 2003 season. So in 2002, I know that the Yankees finished with 103 wins and 58 losses. If I'm trying to predict the 2003 Yankees win-loss record, I might just use the 2002 record and say that should be a decent prediction of the quality of the team, so perhaps they will be 103 and 58 in 2003 as well. Typically a team will play 162 games, but occasionally a game may have to be cancelled, so it's an anomaly that the Yankees only played 161 games in this season. With that in mind, using this win-loss record, we may predict that in 2003 the Yankees won, let's say, 104 games and lost 58. By predicting they have 104 wins, we bring the total up to the expected 162. So perhaps this is a decent prediction, but maybe there's a more sophisticated way we could predict a win-loss record. In the 1980s, our stats-obsessed friend Bill James came up with just such a method, using a team's win-loss record in one year to predict their win-loss record in the next year is a fine start. It's nice that it's so simple, but it's not necessarily a great way to make predictions. There's another way that Bill James came up with, which is also incredibly simple and is actually a big improvement. The method he introduced was called Pythagorean Expectation. Bill James thought instead of using something quite as simple as wins and losses to predict wins and losses, perhaps we should use the runs that a team scores and the runs that they allow, since in the end, winning games comes down to scoring runs and not allowing the other team to do so. Bill James' Pythagorean expectation formula says that the percent of games a team should win, which we'll just write as win percent, is approximated by this ratio. their number of runs scored squared divided by the runs scored squared plus the runs allowed squared. Of course, the runs allowed are the number of runs scored by their opposing teams. You can see where this gets its Pythagorean name. If you imagine multiplying both sides by the denominator, we would have a thing squared plus a thing squared times win percent equals thing squared. Of course, it only looks Pythagorean because the exponent is 2, and indeed, it's funny that's how this should work out. But let's try using this Pythagorean expectation formula with the 2002 Yankees to predict how many games they should win in 2003. In 2002, the Yankees scored 897 runs, so we would begin with 897 squared. They allowed 697 runs, so this is going to be divided by 897 squared plus that number of runs allowed squared. That's 697 squared. And this is about 0.624. So this means, based on the Pythagorean expectation formula and the Yankees' runs scored and allowed, we would expect them to have won this portion of their games in 2002. So we would take that 0.624 and multiply it by the number of games typically in a season, which is 162. So the Pythagorean expectation would have had the Yankees winning 101 games in 2002, and thus losing 61 games. Now, as we know, they actually won 103 games in 2002 and lost 58. So based on the Pythagorean expectation, the Yankees overperformed just a little bit. They won a couple more games than we would have expected. The idea of the statistic is it tells us if the team overperformed or underperformed, and thus what we might be able to expect in the following year. Since in 2002, the Yankees won more games than their Pythagorean expectation would suggest, we might think that they should win fewer games in 2003, perhaps more in line with the Pythagorean expectation based on their 2002 performance. So then what happened in 2003? How many games did the Yankees win, and how many did they lose? Well, our prediction that was just based on wins and losses in 2002 gave us a predicted record of 104 and 58 for 2003. Well, it turns out in 2003, the Yankees went 101 and 61, exactly matching their Pythagorean expectation from the preceding year. This is just a small example that shows the Pythagorean expectation formula in baseball may indeed have some merit. But indeed, if you try applying it over a far greater number of seasons, it proves itself to be a pretty good predictor of a team's wins and losses. You apply the Pythagorean expectation formula to their runs scored and allowed in one year, and use that to predict their record in the next. Now let's talk about this exponent of 2. It's funny that this exponent should work, and thus make this formula for predicting baseball wins look fairly Pythagorean. But what does that exponent of 2 really mean? Well, imagine the exponent was 0 instead of 2. Then the formula would look like this. We would be predicting a team's win percentage to be the runs scored to the power of 0, so I'll just write RS to the power of 0, divided by the runs scored to the power of 0, plus the runs allowed to the power of 0. Any non-zero number to the power of 0 is 1. So when we evaluate this, it's going to be 1 divided by 1 plus 1, because anything to the power of 0 is 1. So the win percentage we would end up predicting is 1 divided by 2, or 50%. This means if the exponent is 0 in that Pythagorean expectation formula, the predicted win percentage will always be 50%, thus meaning that the games are entirely up to luck. It's just a flip of the coin. It's purely a game of chance. This, of course, would not be an appropriate formula to use because baseball is not a game of chance. But indeed, the bigger the exponent is, the further away it gets from 0, the less random chance chance is factored into the prediction. In other words, the bigger the exponent is, the more the disparity between runs scored and runs allowed will impact the predicted win percent. So, this sort of formula can actually be applied to sports outside of baseball. However, the exponent will need to be adjusted to account for the different levels that chance plays in a game of each sport. For example, in basketball, the scoring is so high that luck is less likely to play a significant role. In baseball, the scoring is usually pretty low, so a couple of lucky hits could be just what an inferior team needs to be a superior team. In basketball, where the scoring is typically a lot higher, this Pythagorean formula can be used, but the exponent that's usually used for basketball is 14. This is much bigger than 2, because in basketball, it's a lot harder for a worse team to beat a better team. So then, what about the sport we actually care about, namely gridiron football? We could get some idea of what the NFL's Pythagorean exponent should be by considering how often underdogs win, if we just suppose that the odds makers are correct when they determine which team is superior by setting the odds. Then we could say that roughly when an underdog wins, they have won thanks to some amount of chance. These days in baseball, underdogs win around 41.2% of the time. Meanwhile, in football, since 2013, underdogs have won about 33.8% of the time. That, of course, is less than in baseball, which means we would think that luck is playing a smaller role in the football games. That means the Pythagorean exponent for gridiron football should be at least a bit bigger than that for baseball. The exponent of 2 works for baseball, although these days typically a smaller exponent is actually used. In football, the exponent that's used for the Pythagorean formula is typically 2.37. Now, knowing Pythagorean expectation and the proper exponent to use to predict win rates in gridiron football, we can see the 2024 15-2 Chiefs season for what it really is, which is a big, fat farce. Let's start back with the Chiefs' 2022 season. The Pythagorean expectation formula for football, of course, is not using runs scored and runs allowed, but rather points scored and points allowed. In 2022, the Chiefs scored, we'll use PF for that, that's points for, they scored 496 points for their team. Sorry, I skipped the 9. Let me squeeze that in there. 496. On the other hand, they allowed, we'll use PA for points allowed, they allowed 369 points from their opponents. We can plug this into that Pythagorean formula to get their Pythagorean expectation for their record for 2022. That would be the points they scored, 496, to the power of, for football, we use 2.37, and then divide by 496 to the 2.37 plus 369 to the 2.37. In the end, this comes out to about 67%, so based on their points scored and points allowed, we would have expected the 2022 Chiefs to win about 67% of their games. So in a 17-game season, the expectation, based on the Pythagorean formula, would be that they win about 11.36 games. Now, what actually happened? Well, what actually happened is that they won 14 games and only lost 3, and then went on to win the Super Bowl. So they overperformed their Pythagorean expectation by a good little bit. But it's not that unusual for a team to exceed its Pythagorean expectation by 2 or 3 games. But since they overperformed their Pythagorean expectation, we would expect that in 2023 they would regress a bit, because this is really how they're playing, but thanks to some amount of chance, they managed to win 14 games. So then, what happened to the Kansas City Chiefs in 2023? Well, just as we would expect based on the Pythagorean expectation from the previous season, they only won 11 games, and they lost 6. And indeed, their points scored and points allowed are right in line with this win-loss record. In 2023, the Chiefs scored 371 points, and their defense allowed 294 points. If you plug this into the Pythagorean expectation formula with that 2.37 exponent, the expected number of wins, once you run the numbers, would be 10.79. So they were right on the money with the expectation here. So we have one year where they overperformed a bit and ended up winning the Super Bowl. The next year, they performed about as we would expect, and they won the Super Bowl again. But this 2024 season is on another level. It's not sustainable, and surely the Chiefs are now finally nearing their doom. Allow me to show you the evidence. Every team will have a difference in percentage between their actual win rate and their Pythagorean win rate, what we would expect their win rate to be based on the points they scored and the points they allowed. Going into the 2023 season, these are the top 4 teams all time in terms of the maximum difference between their actual win rate and their Pythagorean win rate. So for example, in 2022, the Vikings' actual win rate was 26.9% above their Pythagorean win rate based on their points scored and points allowed. So what does history have to say about this? Did these teams that significantly outperformed their Pythagorean win rates go on to win it all, or did reality come to bear when they hit the playoffs? Well, in 2022, these Vikings, who had the highest disparity in actual win rate and Pythagorean win rate of all time, they lost the first round of the playoffs. They lost in the wild card round. So things did not work out for them at all. Now, what about the 1992 Colts, who also won way more games than their Pythagorean win rate would have projected? Well, they didn't even make the playoffs. Then what about the 1982 Los Angeles Raiders? Well, they didn't get knocked out in the wild card round, and they did make it to the playoffs, but they were knocked out in the divisional round. That's the second round of the playoffs. And finally, the 2012 Colts, well, they were also knocked out in round 1. They lost the wild card round. So the history is clear. Sometimes a team is going to win way more than their Pythagorean expectation. But the fact of the matter is, once you get to the playoffs, where the competition is a lot more stiff and there's a whole lot on the line, the luck starts to run out. None of these teams even made it to the championship game, the game that you have to win just to get to the Super Bowl. This, of course, is all leading to the 2024 Chiefs and what their Pythagorean expectation has been. So here are the numbers for the 2024 Kansas City Chiefs, who won 15 games and only lost 2. The number of points they scored, the points for the team, was 385. Meanwhile, the number of points they allowed, the PA, was 326. Let's go ahead and plug these numbers into the formula for Pythagorean expectation. Remember that this is a real sport, and so the exponent is 2.37 for gridiron football. This turns out to be about 0.597. So based on their points scored and points allowed, from Pythagorean expectation, we would think that they would win about 60% of their games. The NFL has a 17-game season, so we would expect them to net about 10 wins this season. And of course, they completely outperformed that. Again, the Chiefs went 15-2, and a Chiefs fan might want to tell you that really it's like they went 16-1, because they sat their starters in the final game of the season, because there was really nothing to gain, and they didn't want to risk injuries. If they played their starters, they probably would be 16-1. By winning 15 of 17 games, the Chiefs achieved an actual win rate of 88.2%. That's in comparison to the Pythagorean expectation of 59.7%. That difference between actual win percent and the Pythagorean expectation is tremendous. It's nearly 30%, which means they are now clearly on top of the list of the teams with this greatest disparity of all time. Now you may think, so what? Sure, these other teams who won way more than their Pythagorean expectation weren't able to net a Super Bowl, but these aren't Chiefs teams, and the Chiefs are a different breed. They dominate the NFL at a level almost unprecedented, and they have Taylor Swift on their side, so it wouldn't be crazy to think that they'll win the Super Bowl despite this great disparity. But in fact, this is not a top 4 list, it's a top 5. The Chiefs have been here before, winning way more games than their Pythagorean expectation would suggest. They had a disparity of 22.2% in the 2020 season, and they did not win the Super Bowl. They did make it further than any of the other teams on this list. They actually got to the Super Bowl, but once there, they got utterly shellacked. They lost 9-31 to the Tom Brady-led Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Now you may think, okay, this is all interesting, but surely if it's some tremendous amount of luck that's allowing the Chiefs to win way above their Pythagorean expectation, we'd be able to see that by looking at the games. Well, sure enough, if you look at the games, you will absolutely see it. YouTuber Isaac Punts made a video going through some of the Chiefs games this season and counting up just how many individual inches the Chiefs are away from losing a bunch of the games that they won. I'll leave a link to his video in the description, but I'll quickly run you through the inches away from defeat that the Chiefs were in several of their games. The point here being that it is merely luck that could have affected the difference of a single inch in many of these cases. For the purpose of these demonstrations, this frog will represent the Chiefs, and this frog will represent their opponent in a given game. And for our football, since I've lost all of my foam footballs, we will use this crumpled up Chiefs logo. In week 1, the Chiefs were playing the Ravens. The Ravens had driven far down the field and were close to scoring a touchdown to tie the game, which would have sent it into overtime where anything could happen. The Ravens certainly could have won. Well, here's what happened. They had one last chance to get a touchdown, and Lamar Jackson threw the ball to Isaiah Likely in the back of the end zone. Isaiah grabs the ball and just barely by a single inch isn't quite able to get his feet in bounds. It's rather difficult to show you on this football field because it's so large, but let me just zoom in here, right? So he's got the ball, bam, there's 1 foot in bounds, all right there, and the other one just barely by a single inch was out of bounds. It wasn't in the end zone. He was out of bounds, so no touchdown, and the Chiefs won. That was a single inch. A single inch prevented that touchdown. In week 2, the Chiefs were playing the Bengals, otherwise known as the team to beat. And Patrick Mahomes was driving down the field, but they were in a rough spot. It was 4th down and 16. They had to pick up at least 16 yards to keep the drive going in order to score points to win the game. Now, sure enough, Patrick Mahomes throws an incompletion, but he threw it to a receiver who, while trying to go up to get the ball, backed right into a Ravens defender. Bam! Just like that. And that was called pass interference. Due to the penalty on the Ravens defender, the Chiefs got an automatic 1st down and proceeded to win the game. If that Bengals defender was something like 4 inches further back, then the Chiefs receiver wouldn't have backed into him when he jumped up to get the ball, and thus there would have been no flag, the incompletion would have stood, and the Chiefs would have lost. In week 9, the Chiefs were driving down the field to win the game against the Buccaneers, and Patrick Mahomes threw an ill-advised pass, which was nearly intercepted by a Buccaneer. His fingers were just around 3 inches away from clutching that ball in his grasp, going down with the interception, and winning the game. In week 10, they were playing the Broncos, who impressively marched down the field and got in field goal range, where all they had to do was kick the ball through the goalposts in order to get 3 points and win the game. But when the ball was kicked, of course, a Chiefs player just managed to get his hands on the ball and blocked the kick, which is a pretty darn rare thing. If the Chiefs player's hand had reached just 4 inches lower, the ball could have soared right over him through the goalposts and netted a win. In week 13, the Raiders were in a similar situation, driving down the field against the Chiefs with a chance to score a field goal and win the game. But for some reason, the Raiders' right guard tapped their center, indicating to him that it was time to start the play, and the center snapped the ball too early. It was not time to start the play. There was a botched snap, the ball was fumbled, and the Chiefs ended up getting it, and game over. Now, surely something here could have been adjusted by a single inch so that the right guard did not think it was time to start the play and didn't signal the center. Perhaps it was some word that the quarterback spoke, perhaps it was a flick of his hand or some rotation of his head, but we'll call it an inch that could have changed the result of this game. That brings us to a total of only 13 inches separating the Chiefs from having lost an additional 5 games. But there's one more very simple example. In Week 14 against the LA Chargers, it was actually the Chiefs that were driving down the field to try to score a game-winning field goal. Eventually, they kicked the ball, and it seemed like their luck had finally run out. Here's the goalpost. I'll just move it forward a little bit so you can see it. And the ball, doink, hits the goalpost, so the field goal surely will be no good. But of course, it's the Chiefs, so that's not how it worked. The ball hit the goalpost and doinked right between the posts. It doinked in, and they won the game, and nobody could believe it. Footballs are very awkwardly shaped things, and if it had just rotated an inch one way or the other, or had just been an inch further to the left, it would have hit the post and bounced out. Field goal no good, Chargers win. That brings us to the Chiefs being a grand total of 14 inches away from having 6 additional losses, and thus they would have had a record of, we could say 9 wins and 8 losses, but if that's how the season was going, they probably would have sat their starters and actually won the last game of the season, and thus they would be 10 wins and 7 losses, which would have been exactly in line with the Pythagorean expectation. Remember, the Pythagorean expectation, based on their points scored and points allowed this season, has them winning about 60% of their games, which is about a 10-7 record. So it's tempting to say that it's the Chiefs' excellent coaching, their excellent staff, and their experience in big game situations that has let them win all of these close games. But when you actually look at the tape, there are a lot of very tiny things that don't have all that much to do with the Chiefs that got them a lot of these wins. Inches away from game-sealing interceptions, inches away from missing a kick and it just luckily doinking in instead of out, inches away from having a touchdown that could have won the Ravens the game, inches away from a kick not being blocked. Kicks are very rarely blocked. You would never count on a blocked kick to win a game. Well, of course, this could all just be honky-tonk hogwash in the end, and they win a 3rd straight Super Bowl when everything's said and done. But I think the numbers, the Pythagorean expectation, everything that we've seen out of this team this season suggests that the Chiefs will not three-peat. So let me know what your predictions are for the NFL playoffs in the comments. And if you're just a math nerd who doesn't care at all about sports, we're gonna get back to the good stuff. I just had to talk about this.
I'm unstable, I'm feeling hard to keep the cable cut and untouch the cable. If Texas Instruments don't reply, I think this time it might be fatal. Wish to sell my own fake, cause I'm jaded.
Hate the odds that I calculated.
Press and pull and pray and push it all the way through the whole blue
Planet faded.
Psychosomatic habits, why you so